مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. حددت انتخاباتنا من يسيطر على الكونجرس، ولكن هل أظهرت الرواية الكاملة عن السياسة في جميع أنحاء أمريكا؟ هل تنبئنا نتائج الانتخابات بكل ما يجب معرفته عن التوجهات الحقيقية في البلاد؟ ما هي الأفكار القديمة التي في طريقها للزوال؟ وما هي القوى الجديدة الصاعدة؟ وكيف ستؤثر هذه التغيرات على النصف الثاني من ولاية ترامب؟ لمناقشة القصص وراء انتخابات 2018 يسرني أن أرحب بالمراقبين البارعين للسياسة الأميركية إيثان إبستين وجيمس أستيل. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Our midterm elections have come and gone, but the stories beneath these elections will give us the direction of American politics far into the future. I'm delighted to have guests with me that will take us deep inside the election campaign to give us a sense of where the American people are really headed. James Astil, Ethan Epstein, thank you very much for joining us today. So both of you spent a lot of time talking to Americans, not just in Washington, which is a strange city, of course, but out there around the country throughout the 2018 election. Let's talk about some of your takeaways. What do you think were the most powerful, evocative themes which dominated the 2018 election? James?
Well, there's a sort of one-word answer to that, unfortunately, and it's Trump. The midterm elections are always famously, as the cliche goes, a referendum on the progress of the president, of the administration. This one was especially so because of what a divisive figure the president is, certainly on the left, and what a rallying figure he is for a portion of the right. And it's hard to overestimate to what extent Trump's shadow was cast over the elections. On the left, there was an effort to run a disciplined, somewhat policy-focused campaign. Healthcare was basically an emphasis for Democrats. But really, how people on the left felt about the president, which was at a record level negative, was the thing that turned out Democratic voters and activists and all the organization that went into this rather extraordinary democratic effort. On the Republican side, there had been an ambition to talk a little bit about policy, about some of the things that a unified Republican government had actually done, principally a large tax cut. But to a rather dispiriting degree, that sort of went out the window, as it turned out, neither to be popular on the left or in the center, or particularly mobilizing on the right. The figure of the president, the threat that the left was seen to represent to the figure of the president, and the cultural issues around immigration in particular that the president stands for were very much the mobilizing issues among Republican voters.
So Donald Trump, for and against, was that the sum total of this election?
I don't think it was the sum total. I think, for example, the continued salience of the migration issue played out quite strongly, particularly in the closing weeks of the campaign. I think that was generally a more motivating force on the right side of the spectrum. In fact, you found Democrats really trying to shy away from even discussing the issue, even when it was sort of at the top of the news in the closing weeks. So I think while there's obviously no denying that the president's unique personality and unique ability to both drive supporters and drive his opponents was obviously a very important factor in these elections, I do think there were policy issues that motivated voters too. And on the left, I would point to healthcare, and on the right, the migration issue, which of course catapulted Trump in 2016, I think also helped his side significantly this time around as well too.
Actually, interesting that you mentioned 2016. Did either of you see any change in the nature of Republican campaign events from 2016 to today, or were we seeing a replay of the sort of events that we saw a couple of years ago?
I think the Republican events were quite similar to the ones we saw in 2016, where you had sort of free-form free association remarks by the president with the candidates he was ostensibly rallying for as kind of supporting characters, which was sort of a strange turn of events. I do think the Democratic campaigns were a little different, though. Hillary Clinton ran a much more she wanted to counter Trump's message with a sort of identity politics message of her own. So the Trump campaign really did, the Hillary Clinton campaign really did accentuate things like immigration and racial justice. Whereas this time around, as James pointed out, there was a much narrower focus on things like health care coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. So I do think the Democratic themes were quite different, which makes sense given that they, of course, had lost in 2016.
James, when you look at the Democratic campaign, do you think that the party has reached some conclusion about which of the two great alternatives is a wiser electoral choice, a hard move to the left in the progressive wing, or an attempt to claim the center and the moderate vote?
No, I don't think so. I think that was never likely in that moderates tended to think that everything bad about the campaigns was because the more radical left had too much influence and vice versa. So there was always going to be a disagreement about what had contributed to democratic success and what had contributed to democratic failure. Within that, there were undoubtedly interesting competing efforts by Democrats to work out how to win. So some candidates clearly running on the left. Most House candidates were more moderate, but the fact that we have a mixed bag of results shows that we don't have a very clear answer to that question. I think that you're right that that's absolutely the central question for Democrats, whether to run on the left and try to rally their emerging coalition of younger voters, non-white voters, well-educated liberals, or whether to attempt a more expansive view, if you like, the traditional view to rally voters in the centre. And I think that there are interesting things that we can say about that, but perhaps the most important is that what this election has shown, I think, is that you cannot sustainably win the Senate by rallying voters on the left. You may win the presidency, you can certainly get a House majority, but you cannot win the Senate. And if you cannot win the Senate sustainably, there is almost limited value to the presidency. So I think that that is a valuable lesson that Democrats would overlook at their peril. And I think, final, very quick additional comment, this whole debate between the left and the centre is somewhat specious. We know that the sort of median voter strategy, which justified moderation on the left, turns out to be full of holes. Voters are not more or less moderate. They may be conflicted between the two parties, but they may well have extreme policy views, which may mix left and right extreme policy views. What voters want is to be energized by a particular candidate. When they choose their candidate, their representative, just as Republicans ended up choosing President Trump in 2016, they will follow that candidate to a series of policy positions. What you need is a candidate that captures the imagination on the left or the right, and voters will be swayed by the policies of that candidate. You don't start with the policies and then look for the candidate.
Interesting. So if you take that premise, then Ethan, the question isn't just what motivates Democrats, it's who motivates Democrats. So as we look over the 2018 legislative election, who would you say were the most motivating Democrats out there?
Quickly, I'm not sure I completely share such a jaundiced view of the electorate that it's, truly driven by personality. I do think policy issues matter to voters, and I actually would point to Trump's example of that. Of course, he was served by his flamboyant personality, but in 2016, it was also his decision to stress issues that separated him from the rest of the Republican field, like immigration and trade, that I think really helped out his political effort, which I think does point to at least some importance as far as policy is concerned.
I must, if I may, briefly
Please,
disagree. Trump noted that Republican voters to a large degree wanted more government, not less government, which had been the conservative mantra for eons. But at the same time, he clearly shifted policy opinion on the right to a large degree, especially on trade. There was a sort of grumbling bias against what Chinese trade was felt to have done to towns in the Midwest on the right, just as on the left. And of course, he pulled in voters that had that view to the Republican coalition. Yeah. But he substantially changed the view of establishment Republicans on trade, brought them to that view in a way that suggested that actually policy opinion, even in the establishment, is rather more malleable than I think you suggest.
A fair point. Can you quickly recapitulate your question? Now I forgot.
So my original question was, if you take the idea that it's not just what Democrats get motivated by, but who does the motivating, who are the most motivating Democrats out there from this campaign?
Well, they were people that actually weren't on the ballot. They were people like California Senator Kamala Harris, who has created sort of a media presence for herself, but she didn't actually have to go through the slog of running this time around. I think the same is true for Cory Booker, who's a senator from New Jersey, too. I mean, they've used sort of television appearances, social media, and they're clearly positioning themselves to run in 2020. But the irony, of course, is that they didn't run this time around, and I'm not sure that any stars, at least for 2020, really emerged out of this election cycle for the Democrats.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to continue this discussion of observations from the 2018 election, and we're going to ask our guests if the Republican Party is now indeed totally and completely the party of Donald Trump. In just a moment. Again, my guests include James Astill. James is the Washington bureau chief for The Economist, perhaps the world's most sophisticated and well-informed news magazine. He is also the Lexington columnist, a platform from which he offers insight into the zaniness of American culture, politics, and society. James has been with The Economist since 2004, serving as South Asia bureau chief based in Delhi, then as an energy and environment editor based in London. In the years before coming to Washington, he was the magazine's political editor and columnist, explaining British politics to the world. Sitting to James's left is Ethan Epstein. Ethan, a native of my hometown, Providence, Rhode Island, has served for 6 years as associate editor of the Weekly Standard, and the last 4 years as contributing editor of National Journal, two of the most influential magazines of ideas and analysis in America today. His expertise is politics and foreign policy, a broad range of topics that has led him to write investigative pieces from as far afield as Beijing, Taipei, Guam, Osaka, Seoul, the U.S.-Mexican border, the China-North Korea border, the oil fields of North Dakota, and small-town Vermont. All right, gentlemen, Ethan, is the Republican Party today totally and completely the party of Donald Trump?
At the grassroots level, it appears to be so. I mean, voters are extremely motivated by a fierce sense of loyalty to the president. And insofar as you can say that one man is in command of a political party, I'd say that guy is at this point, yes.
James, you agree?
Yes, broadly. I think that Ethan's absolutely right about the electorate. Trump has built a powerful cult of personality, might not be too strong a phrase to describe his hold on his electorate over and above and beyond their association with the party. I think we have yet to see how indelibly changed by Trump congressional Republicans are, and with a weaker hand on the Hill, we may see a little bit more resistance to the president from Republicans in the Senate especially.
Interesting. Now, we've always said that there were three strands of Republicans, or three trends in the Republican Party. Social Republicans, social conservatives, fiscal conservatives, and defense foreign policy hawks. The president seems to have added a fourth trend, sort of nationalists. But if you look at the party, which of these trends is in the ascendance? Which of the trends is in decline? How is that evolving, Ethan?
Yeah, I'd say those three traditional strands within the Republican Party have been replaced by the one strand that is the Trump Republican Party. It's interesting because if you actually look at sort of the survey data of which part of that coalition has been most loyal to the president, it's perhaps the one people would least expect, given that he's a multi-times married kind of libertine, and that's social conservatives. Evangelical Christians are perhaps the strongest part of Donald Trump's coalition. It might seem bizarre on its face, but he has, actually to my surprise, because I expected him to govern as more of a sort of socially libertarian president, he has repeatedly delivered for social conservatives. For example, redefining the way the federal government determines gender, which was a huge win for that part of the Republican coalition. So if there's one that I think really is in the ascendant and has sort of the powerful hold right now, it would be they.
How do you explain that? James, you talk to all sorts of people.
Because it turns out that social conservatives and evangelicals, more or less overlapping a couple of categories, are concerned about culture, not the integrity of their leaders. And a president with abhorrent personal morals, it appears, who says to them, "I will protect you," is bound to be extremely popular. Nobody has done that for them. Not with that force, not to speak to the anxiety and fear that they feel at the rough end of every big judicial decision of the last 20, 30 years in terms of their conservative culture. Their America, as they see it, that is being changed too rapidly, perhaps inevitably, but anyway too rapidly by the left in this country. And Trump spoke to that anxiety and that fear, and that is why he's so popular.
I want to ask you about an issue that we didn't hear much at all about during the campaign, but which hovers over American politics, and that's the investigations about the president. The Mueller investigation, collusion with foreign powers, an issue which really didn't seem to get a lot of attention from any side during this campaign. Is my impression right? And if so, why was that the case? One would have thought that this is a huge national issue. Why didn't it get the attention that one might have thought it deserved?
One would have thought that if they simply relied on the Washington Post and CNN for their sense of what is important to the country. And I consider myself a fairly astute consumer and producer of news, but even I found the endless twists and turns and these little news nuggets that you saw to be actually stultifying. I think it was actually so overcovered perhaps a year ago that Americans essentially stopped paying attention to it. And obviously survey data indicated that to both parties because, as you point out, neither side really wanted to talk about it, showing that it really didn't motivate voters on either side. I think that's partially the result of the way it was covered, as I'm saying, and also partially the result of a sense that there was no collusion and the fact that there was never, prior to the election, a definitive statement one way or the other.
I disagree with that. I think that it's enormously important, and the coverage, though hysterical in cable TV, 24-hour news TV, unfortunately, exaggerates the drama of small details and often speculative details. Yeah. But I do think that, on the one hand, this has never been of a first priority importance to almost any American voters, and yet at the same time, it has become polarizing in a way that was sort of set in stone before the midterms, and therefore it didn't need to be tested by the midterms. On the right, voters believe that the president has been unfairly treated, that there's no evidence of collusion, and I think that a sense of defending the presidency, which feeds into that, was nonetheless a big motivating factor for Republican voters on the right. So in a sense, again, the president was a proxy for how they might feel about the Russian investigation. On the left, a sense that the president is unfit, which the left feeling about what we've found out from the Mueller investigation so far is certainly coherent with, was very much a sort of energizing, mobilizing force on the left. So there's a sort of there are proxies for how Americans feel about the Mueller investigation at work in the electorate, even if they may not care about the details of the investigation very much. Fascinating.
So, since we already know, we know he's guilty or we know he's innocent, no need to debate it in the election campaign.
To a degree, I think it's about the role of the president the threat on the left that the president is going beyond the rule of law, the fear that the president is being unfairly constrained by the liberal media, by the left generally on the right. These were forces in there.
All right, gentlemen, I have to thank you very much. We've run out of time. Thank you for helping to explain our midterm elections and what is beneath the surface to our viewers abroad. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The SEC oversees our financial markets, and it does that through a number of different mechanisms. First of all, it's the agency that enforces our disclosure laws. So anytime a company issues securities to sell to American investors, they've got to comply with our rules, and in fact, they go back and forth with our staff about what they have to disclose and why. We also oversee our stock exchanges, which is an increasingly important part of the SEC's mission. What we do is make sure that our stock exchanges are stable, safe, and are competitive, are delivering trading and access to our capital markets to American investors on the competitive terms they deserve.
Our midterm elections have come and gone, and with them has also gone the great timeout on the investigations that have dogged President Trump since his earliest days in office. Never before in American history has a presidential administration been tagged with accusations of scandal as early as was the case with the Trump administration. It was still in the transition period before President Trump even took office when the first charges of collusion with Russia were made. The president had not fully unpacked his bags in the White House when the administration had its first casualty due to scandal. National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. Remember him? Since then, the charges and countercharges have been daily fare, with the special counsel chalking up some significant successes, including the conviction of the president's campaign chairman and the plea bargain with the president's personal attorney. The investigation was not a major issue in the congressional election campaign, as so many other topics, from trade wars to the border wall to the Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination, more than filled the airtime. In essence, Robert Mueller, the special counsel, gave the nation a timeout so the people could vote. But now that the dust has settled from the election, attention will return again to the charges against the president's campaign and against him himself concerning collusion with foreign powers in the run-up to the 2016 elections. I hope we hear definitively from Mr. Mueller, and soon. The entire 115th Congress, the sitting of the House and Senate since January 2017, occurred under the cloud of this investigation. It would be a shame if the 116th Congress operated under the same cloud. It would be worse for the nation. Given the fact that presidential campaigns start earlier and earlier each 4-year cycle, we will soon have our first announced candidates for the 2020 election. The American people need to know if one of those likely candidates, Donald Trump, is accused by an independent counsel of having broken the law to achieve his current position. Whatever one thinks of the president, whether you are a supporter or a critic, you should not want to wait another year for clarity on accusations against him. You should want to know the outcome of the investigation in a matter of weeks, not months. We have enough division in our country already. Keeping the nation in suspense only makes the situation worse. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول نتائج انتخاباتنا التشريعية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.